If you were to jump into a time machine and take a trip through both space and time, back to the heyday of the Wild West, you'd walk into the settled communities turned ghost towns, all riddled with the same establishments. Regardless of town or territory, you'll more than likely find a stagecoach station, a couple of general stores, countless saloons, and if your ghost town saw its fair share of vices, probably a dance hall or gambling house on the outskirts. Without a doubt, however, between all settlements and interstate junctions, the most consistent business offered by these small locales were hotels, filled with travelers, transplants, and dogged men finding their place on a frontier filled with the unknowns. The American West was a popular land for those going places, whether it was the dreamy young folks leaping coast to coast, or outlaws running town to town from a bounty, or even desperate workers spinning job site to job site. The popular nature of travel in the Wild West also came hand in hand with the lawlessness the territory saw, hotels becoming the breeding ground for vigilante justice, untempered gunfights, and just about any other seedy activity you could imagine. With these patterns then came the stories that they left behind, as many Western hotels saw the notorious and infamous figures leave behind a legacy both of intrigue and horror. As towns were abandoned and their hotel rooms left empty, the ghosts came back to flock the western frontier with an unsettling presence, leaving the people who visit afterwards to get a spine-chilling sense of the spirits that linger in the shadows of yesteryear. To dive deeper into these mysterious happenings and the frightening folklore behind them, here are 3 of the most haunted hotels from the Wild West. The origins of the Bullock Hotel date back all the way to August 1876 in Helena, Montana, where American businessman and politician Seth Bullock ran his small hardware outfit while carrying out his duties as sheriff of Lewis and Clark County. Meanwhile, 500 miles away, in the recently gold-stricken settlement called Deadwood of the Dakota Territory, legendary gunfighter Wild Bill Hickok was shot in the back of the head by Jack McCall during a game of cards. The lethal gunshot spurred loud cries by the rest of the Deadwood citizens, who were exhausted by the outright violence and general lawlessness Deadwood had seen in the few years since gold was discovered in the nearby Black Hills. Not long afterwards, Seth Bullock arrived in Deadwood with fellow frontiersman Solomon Starr. The two had pegged the gold rush town as a potential fit for their future hardware store, and moved from Montana to capitalize on the opportunity. On that humid August afternoon, Bullock and company rode into Deadwood on their ox-drawn caravan, prepped with Dutch ovens and mining gear. They set up a tent by nightfall, and were auctioning off equipment and turning a small profit before the sun could rise the following day. Soon, they advertised themselves as Office of Starr and Bullock, auctioneers and commission merchants. Within a few months, the shrewd business duo were seeing success after success, and eventually bought a vacant lot on the corner of Main Street and Wall Street. This is where their business would run henceforth, evolving from a simple tent to an entire warehouse fronted by a sturdy hardware store. While the hardware trade was off to a booming success, that wasn't the only draw to Bullock's recent arrival in the gold rush town. Deadwood saw Bullock's history as a lawman and former sheriff in Montana as the perfect resume for Sheriff of Deadwood. The recent shooting of Wild Bill Hickok forced the hand of higher-ups across the Dakota Territory and frontier at large, the rate of violence untenable for much longer. Of course, Seth Bullock was up to the task, embracing the role without reservations. In March of 1877, just a little over 6 months since Bullock's arrival in Deadwood, he was appointed as the first sheriff by the former governor of the Dakota Territory, John L. Pennington. It didn't take long for Bullock to establish a presence in the town, once known for its outlaws and vices. He gathered up a ragtag team of deputies he felt matched his fearless, hard-nosed demeanor, and set out to change Deadwood from crime and chaos to law and order. Unfortunately, Bullock's reign didn't last long, as an official election was held later in November of 1877, and John J. Manning was voted sheriff by the citizens of Deadwood. Nevertheless, Bullock didn't let the decision deter his efforts in the town. In fact, his short stint as sheriff was so successful, he felt Deadwood was safe enough to bring up his wife and daughter from their home in Michigan. A couple of years later, in September of 1879, Bullock and Starr's hardware store at the corner of Main and Wall Streets survived a raging fire that laid waste to over 300 separate buildings and the precious mementos belonging to Deadwood citizens. As a result, many folks affected by the fire left town to start fresh elsewhere, but it didn't deter the likes of Seth Bullock or Sol Starr. Rather, they used the opportunity to bring uplifted spirits to the remaining folks of Deadwood and saw continued success over the next decade and a half. That is, until 1894, when the hardware store did fall victim to another intense fire, with the entirety of the storefront burning to ash. While the warehouse in the back managed to stay standing, Bullock and Starr were left in the rubble that they so luckily avoided back in 1879. The two business partners didn't let the newfound opportunity go to waste. From the ashes, Bullock and Starr constructed a brand new structure to be transformed into not only a brand new general store, but also the finest hotel in all of Deadwood, South Dakota, and the surrounding settlements. Thus, wagon after wagon carrying the white and pink sandstone from Boulder Canyon was hauled in, and the beginnings of the Bullock Hotel were underway. In its first rendition, the Bullock Hotel was designed in the Italianate style, with Victorian notes dotted throughout the structure. When you entered the lobby, one could see carpet of the finest red velvet canvassing the floor, with oak trim lining the corners and big, beautiful brass chandeliers hanging overhead. Not only that, but the hotel itself featured a massive restaurant with 100 seats, a gorgeous grand piano, 63 bedrooms made from the finest materials, luxurious bathrooms, as well as a library and parlor sitting just off the balcony. It didn't take long for the Bullock Hotel to not only become the talk of the town, but the talk of western South Dakota and the western frontier in general. By 1900, the hotel featured a gentleman's bar adjacent to the building, and Bullock lived in the remaining years of his life in full servitude to his most prized business, before dying of cancer on his private ranch in 1919. In 1976, the hotel was sold and transitioned back into just a hardware store, until it was reacquired by Bullock Properties in the 1990s and restored to a hotel. The present-day version operates much like it did in 1895, albeit with fewer rooms featuring modern bathrooms and updated finishings. While Seth Bullock is no longer around physically to look after his hotel, many folks claim he still wanders around the structure on a spiritual level. Bully's Restaurant and Seth's Cellar, two iconic locations within the building, are the most popular places to see the imposing ghost of Bullock himself. The reasoning is that Bullock remains at the hotel to make sure even the present-day staff stick to their work. These ghost sightings and other supernatural happenings usually occur in moments when workers slow down or stop their labor completely. These paranormal events include floating silverware or dishes, self-operating shower heads, flickering lights, and stationary objects sliding left or right with no one around. There's also the constant reports of hearing a male's voice, most likely that of Seth Bullock, calling out guests by their correct name during late-night hours. These are usually paired with other instances of footsteps in empty rooms and whistling throughout corridors. If one were to enter the bedrooms located on the second or third floor, they might find a strange apparition in the background of their photographs. That is, if the camera works at all. The Bullock Hotel also plays host to a beautiful antique clock that's been broken for years, and yet guests will still hear it chime from time to time. And that's not the only clock-related scare. If one fancies unplugging their alarm clock before sleeping, they might still awake to the blaring sounds of the alarm screech, finding a power source where there originally wasn't one. Whatever power source this is can't be fathomed, but it's probably the same supernatural source that keeps the televisions playing during outages and lights flickering on even when the bulbs are dead. The most frequent sighting comes in the form of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of the hotel. Some say they can see a man dressed in black, hiding behind the crowds that form in the lobby, while others state that the shadows look like a tall cowboy covered in darkness, stationed at the bar in the cellar before disappearing in the blink of an eye. The Bullock Hotel is now so well known for its haunts and horrors, official ghost tours can be experienced by Deadwood visitors year-round. It's been the subject of popular series, Ghost Adventures and Unsolved Mysteries, and is the perfect relic depicting the ghosts of the Wild West in their purest form. In the early 1890s, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad sought further expansion of its development into Wyoming and the surrounding territories. As the railroad was scheduled to run through the recently appointed county seat of Sheridan County, city officials knew traffic through the town would increase. This, combined with money from Chicago investors to expand the coal mining industries around Sheridan, provided the need for further lodging near the railroad. As a result, the railroad company hired the bright mind of architect Thomas R. Kimball to design a top-end hotel for Sheridan to attract westward travelers. Kimball remembered the luxurious display of hotels he found in Scotland not too long prior, and felt it was the perfect style to fit the newly named Sheridan Inn. The Sheridan was built as a 3-story structure with large porches set along each of the 64 rooms, all featuring a window and electric lights. The Sheridan was also the first Wyoming lodging to offer bathtubs to its visitors, and was long considered the finest of all hotels between Chicago and San Francisco. The Sheridan Inn officially opened on May 27, 1893, with a grand ceremony welcoming guests into the freshly furnished dining room a month later on June 27th. This celebration was led by legendary soldier and showman Buffalo Bill Cody, who would take over the management of the hotel the following year. In the meantime, the Sheridan was initially managed by George and Lucy Canfield. They mostly hosted fellow Wyoming ranchers who needed a place to stay while their actual homes were being built. During these days, it only cost $1 a night for a stay, in addition to a quarter breakfast or a $half lunch or dinner. For long-term residents, they could purchase a meal ticket for $7 that was good for 21 meals at any point of the day. After a few months, Buffalo Bill Cody realized a new potential with the Sheridan's clientele. He was popular amongst buffalo hunters, as he was one of the finest in all of the West. With all of his fellow big game hunters looking for lodging in the nearby Bighorn Mountains, the Sheridan Inn was the perfect place to entertain guests and give his hunters the stay of their lifetime. Thus, in 1894, Buffalo Bill purchased the Sheridan, which just so happened to sit across the street from his own stagecoach station called the W.F. Cody Transportation Company. Between 1894 and 1901, when Buffalo Bill sold the Sheridan, he hosted countless extravagant parties that saw the most important names stay within the walls of the Wyoming Hotel. Even after Buffalo Bill passed on the ownership, celebrities and well-known folks from around the United States flocked to the Sheridan Inn, including the likes of Ernest Hemingway, Herbert Hoover, and Bob Hope. By the 1960s, the building was labeled condemned, as it had fallen by the wayside with drastically decreased patronage and uninterested ownership. In the 50-plus years since, the Sheridan has switched between various owners, reopened as a community center, before being refurbished into a restaurant and most recently as a hotel once more. It's through these reopenings and renewal of the Sheridan as a functioning hotel that its paranormal history was finally experienced by both workers and patrons alike. The ghost stories originate all the way back to the final years of Buffalo Bill's involvement with the hotel, when a small family from Virginia moved to Sheridan, Wyoming. The family, called the Arnolds, had a daughter named Catherine, who was 22 years old at the time and in search of employment. Within weeks of their arrival, Catherine acquired a position at the Sheridan, where she acted as a jack of all trades. For 64 years, Catherine remained loyal to the hotel, taking on the duties of a housekeeper, clerk, and seamstress, just to name a few. In 1965, Catherine, who is now referred to as Miss Kate by her admirers, was out of a job after the building was shut down. However, the position was returned to her when new ownership reopened the inn by 1967 as a dancing and dining hall. A year later, in 1968, Miss Kate passed away, but not before delivering one final request in her will: to be laid to rest at the only place she ever called home, the Sheridan Inn. To honor her wishes, the folks at the hotel took her ashes and placed them within the walls of her third-story room, seemingly the end of Miss Kate's presence at the Sheridan. However, that would hardly be the case as the years went on. By the 1990s, the inn was transformed into a lunch and dinner restaurant called the Wyoming Rib and Chop House. Through this transition, Miss Kate's original bedroom was renovated, but her favorite chair was kept against the same wall her ashes resided in. From here on out, the staff at the Sheridan, regardless of its name or ownership, has claimed to feel the presence of Miss Kate nearly every single day, and especially every single night. Besides the occasional light flicker or door slam, the most popular paranormal event within Sheridan's walls is a cold spot phenomenon, occurring in that very room Miss Kate called home for over 60 years. Employees have reported that cold spots move to different areas of the room, but can also be felt around the ballroom and near windows on the first floor, all places Miss Kate frequented during her time there. Passerby will also report strange happenings around the upstairs windows. One such tale was told by a man who drove by around 2 a.m., only to see the third-floor windows darkened by closed drapes. 30 minutes later, the same man drove by again, but this time, the windows were clear of drapes and the lights shone from above. At first, the man just thought a guest might have awoken in the early morning hours. However, upon closer inspection, the inn was currently closed at the time, and there were no visitors allowed to stay the night at the Sheridan. When the man called, the staff informed him that they didn't have any overnight employees who were working within rooms at such a late hour, but were unaware of any break-ins or criminal activity in the town at the time. If one were to visit the Sheridan Inn in modern times, you might hear a lonely lady's footsteps stomping around empty rooms or the whirring of a phantom sewing machine, handled by the ghost of the woman who looked after the Sheridan Inn from the days of Buffalo Bill to the later days of its deconstruction. One thing is for sure, the hotel itself wasn't the only thing brought back from the ashes, but rather 100-plus years of history and haunts and the restless soul of one of Wyoming's most treasured icons. At the turn of the 20th century, western Arizona saw a boom in mining camps and small settlements pop up across its arid deserts and rocky hillsides. One such tent city was called Oatman, Arizona, serving as both a resting spot and home base for a slew of miners and their infrequent families looking for work in the southwestern region of the United States. In 1902, city planners in Oatman realized the potential for additional lodging to accompany the increase in population and hired John Durlin to construct the Durlin Hotel in 1902. The Durlin featured 8 rooms in its 2-story structure, located right in the heart of Main Street. It was designed with the Spanish colonial revival architecture in mind, built with adobe, and attracted additional mining parties over the next few years. The hotel and the town of Oatman in general saw an explosion in success in 1915, when a nearby mining company discovered over $10 million worth of gold in the vicinity, valued at nearly $300 million when adjusted for inflation. With the 1915 gold rush, Oatman saw its population grow to over 3,500 people, and the Durlin Hotel was sold out on almost a nightly basis. Unfortunately, the fame and fortune didn't last forever. In the 5 years between 1915 and 1920, Oatman fell victim to 3 separate fires, all incredibly destructive that saw most of the town razed to the ground. Luckily, the Durlin Hotel was never completely destroyed, and repairs brought it back to its former glory by the time the Roaring Twenties were underway. Again, though, the Durlin's second wind was short-lived, as the United Eastern Mines shut down in 1924, effectively removing all major mining operations in Arizona on a permanent basis. Just as all seemed lost for the Durlin Hotel and the Oatman at large, the legendary Route 66 highway was installed across the southern United States. With travelers now stopping by the ghost town to be, tourism drove Oatman back into relevancy, and the Durlin could keep its doors open. Over the next 40 years or so, the Durlin Hotel played host to countless tourists and honeymooners, but maybe none more famous than the likes of Hollywood icons Clark Gable and his newlywed wife, Carole Lombard. The pair spent their first night as a married couple at the Durlin, and returned to Oatman, Arizona to get away from the spotlight various times over the next 3 years, until sadly, Carole Lombard passed away from a plane crash in 1942. Nevertheless, the Durlin Hotel continued its famous run until the 1960s put an end to its heyday for good. By this point, Interstate 40 was completed, and the popularity of Route 66 quickly diminished, as travelers started using the faster and wider I-40 to trek across the Arizona deserts, either into California or back east to New Mexico. As a result, the Durlin Hotel, ultimately renamed to the Oatman Hotel, couldn't continue its operation like it once had in the early 20th century. The town itself dwindled down to about 100-year-long residents, and Oatman now features just a couple of gift shops, tourist attractions, and restaurants, most notably the Oatman Hotel, which presently no longer offers hotel accommodations for guests. The lack of lodging at the Oatman Hotel, however, doesn't detract from its modern-day infamy. Rather, the hotel has now regained popularity purely for its acclaimed paranormal sightings and all-around spooky supernatural events. The biggest draw of the Oatman is the rumors that it still houses the ghosts of Clark Gable and Carol Lombard, frequent admirers of the hotel even in the afterlife. Folks who tour the hallways often speak about hearing quiet laughter and muffled whispers around the room Gable and Lombard stayed in every time they paid a visit to the Oatman. While the building no longer operates as a functioning hotel, it has kept the Gable-Lombard room in the same style it was in when the couple first stayed in 1939, giving visitors a unique look back in time and history. One account goes that a few years ago, a photographer was taking pictures of the old Gable-Lombard honeymoon suite for a personal project. When he went to develop the photographs, however, he noticed a gray apparition of what appeared to be the ghost of an adult male lingering in the background of the empty room. While the photographer believed the ghostly silhouette was the spirit of Clark Gable, he threw out his entire Oatman Hotel project out of the fear of further haunts. Another mystifying phenomenon at the hotel was the reports of the invisible sleepers. On the second floor, there is a room called the Theater Room Museum, which still houses a couple of beds that had been in the room since the early days of the Durlin. On more than one occasion, a maid has entered the Theater Room Museum and found imprints in the dust on the bed that perfectly resemble the outline of someone sleeping. Thinking there must have been an intruder, investigators were brought in, but found nothing else in the room had been tampered with, or in the hotel at large. The current staff at the hotel believe these imprints were left behind by the ghost of an original chambermaid who returned to the Oatman after passing in the room long ago. The restless spirits of the two Golden Age icons and a former worker aren't the only ones lurking in the shadows of the Durlin. Legend has it that there's a third guest room still occupied by the ghost of an old Irish miner by the name of Odie. The story goes that Odie came to America at the end of the 19th century with a plan to strike gold and build a fortune for his family's future in the United States. In a horrifying twist, however, Odie's family never made it across the Atlantic and died at sea before they could reunite with the Irish miner. Unable to cope with his loss, Odie turned to alcohol and spent many a night drinking by his lonesome in his little dark room at the Durlin Hotel. One night, he went around back and laid against the facade of the hotel, only to never wake up. He was found dead the next morning. The story doesn't end there. In the years since Odie nursed his final bottle, folks have felt extreme cold spots in the old room he frequented, even on the hottest days of the summers in western Arizona. Others have claimed they can hear the faint sounds of bagpipes being played from the empty room, while some go as far as to say that the sheets will be torn off the bed even after days of being well kept and untouched. Regardless of which spirit is causing mischief at the Durlin Hotel, rest assured the ghosts of Oatman are not there to scare, but rather play games with the frightened yet fascinated guests. Of course, the same can't be said for all lodging relics dotting the Wild West, with plenty of horrifying haunts still yet to be discovered.